Hello, good evening. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander. Another step, the fifth step, I think, in our walking tour through the Bible. One of the reasons why we read the Bible is because it's a book that needs to be read again and again and again. Every time you read it, something new pops up. Some new insight appears before you, which you hadn't realized was there. In other words, the more we read, the more we understand, the more deeply we go into the text. Now, we all know the story of Noah and his ark. We do, don't we? And this is Genesis chapters, here we go, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's a very long episode. And we know the story about how Noah goes into the ark, what he takes into the ark, why God sends a flood, what happens during the flood, how the flood waters recede and all that. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to go into chapter 9, which is the covenant God makes with Noah at the end of the flood. Now, this is extremely important, and I get the impression really that people haven't considered this enough. Might be a bit of a cheek of me to say that. Perhaps they've written endless tomes about Genesis 9. First of all, it is the first mention in the Bible of the covenant. That is to say, the agreement between God and man, or rather, the gift that God gives to man, to the human race, of his unconditional love. In other words, God's giving of a constitution, if you like. What we don't earn, but what God gives. The covenant is a gift. And God says right at the end of the passage about the covenant, which is 9:17, that the rainbow is the sign of the covenant that I have established between myself and all living things on the earth. It's very curious that this covenant is not just a covenant with human beings, it's a covenant with all living things on the earth. And what one sees in these 17 verses, the first 17 verses of chapter 9, is what's often called a consistent ethic of life emerging. It's not quite coherent. It's not quite as we would expect to find it, that is to say, every contradiction ironed out. But there is something very important here. For example, he who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, says God. In other words, murder, the taking of human life, is a terrible offence against God. And therefore, if anybody commits this offence, they are to be put to death, which is contradictory. I think we'll agree, because whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Well, the man who sheds the blood of the one who's shed the blood of man, doesn't he shed the blood of man and also incur the same penalty? Does seem the case, doesn't it? But we see here an ethic of life. And he also says, and he says why you must not commit murder. For in the image of God was man created. Then he goes on to something else. Murder is forbidden, but he then says, be fruitful then and multiply, teem over the earth and subdue it. Then he talks about the protection of all of creation, but he also talks about the human being being the steward of creation. It's really calling to mind Genesis 2, the creation story. The human being is put in charge of the earth. Human being is to protect the earth. Human being is to steward the earth, to subdue it as well, but also to care for it. And the human being is to be fruitful and multiply, and the human being is to do no murder. Now, these three things are very, very important. Care of the environment, respect for human life, and procreation. It's a very curious passage, this, and it's a great challenge to modern people, because nowadays people are telling us if we want to care for the environment, then we must have fewer children and we must reduce the population, because overpopulation is the greatest challenge there is to the well-being of the planet. Now, that is certainly not found here, because we're told look after the planet and procreate, fill the earth. So teem over the earth and subdue it. In other words, go everywhere all over the earth. No more wildernesses. Civilize the earth. Take it over. Take over the entire planet. Now, that contradicts this idea that somehow or another that those who don't produce children are somehow doing the planet a favor. That's not God's vision. Now, of course, people would say, well, of course, when this was written, the population of the world was tiny, and that compared to today, and therefore the idea of overpopulation was simply unheard of. Actually, that's not true, really, because there was overpopulation in the ancient world. So, for example, the population of Italy in the time of the Emperor Augustus could not feed itself. So that's overpopulation, really, in that Italy had grown too big a population to feed itself. And similarly, I assume, the ancient cities of Sumeria, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, too must have had periodic food shortages because the concentrated population was not, it was too big to be sustained by the territory in which it was. So the idea that people didn't know about it, overpopulation, or they didn't ever think, oh, there are too many people about, is not true, it seems to me. The other thing is a consistent ethic of life must be part of our care for the planet. The people on the planet and the planet, both of them need to be cared for. We can't say we must sacrifice human beings for the good of the planet. Now, the good of human beings and the good of the planet go together, is what God is saying here. And God, is the ultimate guarantor of the good of the planet, because the more we respect God, the more we respect his covenant with all creation. So every time we see an animal, we say this is one of God's creatures too, I think is what it's saying here. Anyway, it gets you thinking this. It's a profound critique of modern environmentalism. It's asking us to rethink our environmentalism in a more godly key. Of course, it's not quite coherent. It's not a theology of environmentalism, but it's rather one of the building blocks towards a theology of environmentalism. All the very best for now. Bye.